One of the most common reasons college friendships begin to fade after graduation is surprisingly simple. Our life paths start to diverge. During college, life feels synchronized. You wake up in the same environment, you attend classes that follow similar schedules, you share the same physical spaces, the cafeteria, the library, the dorm hallway at midnight. Your lives overlap in hundreds of small ways that you hardly notice at the time. Friendship in that context becomes effortless. It grows in the spaces between lectures, in late-night conversations, in the shared stress of exams, and the quiet relief when the semester ends. But graduation marks the end of that shared rhythm. Suddenly, the structure that once held everyone together disappears. One friend moves to another city for a job, another decides to pursue graduate school, someone else returns to their hometown to help their family business, and someone perhaps takes time to travel or to figure out what comes next. None of these choices are wrong. In fact, they are expressions of growth, but they begin to pull lives in different directions. And here is something important to understand about relationships. Proximity is one of the most powerful forces that sustains them. When people live close to each other, connection happens almost automatically. You run into each other, you share meals, you make spontaneous plans. But when geography changes, friendship requires something different. It requires intention. Now you must plan the call instead of bumping into each other on campus. You must schedule the visit months in advance rather than walking down the hall. And for many people, this is the moment when the friendship begins to shift. Not because the affection disappears, but because the infrastructure of the relationship has changed. In college, friendship is woven into daily life. After graduation, it must compete with the demands of adult life. Careers begin to take shape. New colleagues enter our world. Romantic relationships deepen. Financial responsibilities appear. Time, which once felt abundant, suddenly becomes scarce. And slowly, almost quietly, the space that once held those friendships begins to shrink. But the divergence of life paths is not only logistical, it is also psychological. College is often a time of shared exploration. Everyone is asking similar questions. Who am I? What do I want to do with my life? What kind of person do I want to become? There is comfort in knowing that everyone around you is navigating the same uncertainty. After graduation, however, the answers begin to vary widely. One friend might find clarity and momentum early in their career. Another may feel lost for a while. One may embrace stability. Another may crave adventure. One may settle into long-term commitment, while another continues searching for direction. And when those life experiences diverge, conversations begin to change as well. Sometimes the friend who is thriving feels hesitant to share their success with someone who is struggling. Sometimes the friend who feels lost withdraws because they believe they are falling behind. Comparison quietly enters the space where companionship once lived. This is not necessarily a failure of friendship. It is a reflection of the natural evolution of adulthood. Relationships are often built on shared context. When the context shifts dramatically, the relationship must adapt in order to survive. Some friendships manage to make that transition beautifully. They evolve, they deepen, they move from being friendships of convenience to friendships of conscious choice. But others fade, not with conflict, not with drama, but with distance. And there is something important to acknowledge here. Fading is not always a sign of betrayal or neglect. Sometimes it is simply the result of two lives expanding in different directions. We often carry the belief that meaningful friendships should last exactly as they were. That if a friendship weakens, someone must have done something wrong. But life rarely works with that level of permanence. Some friendships belong to a particular chapter of life. They shape us, they support us, they help us become who we are meant to be. And then, as the story moves forward, they loosen their hold, not because they were insignificant, but because they served their purpose during a specific moment of growth. The challenge, then, is not to prevent every friendship from changing. The challenge is to recognize which ones deserve intentional effort as life paths diverge. Because the friendships that survive distance are rarely the ones that simply happen. They are the ones that are chosen again and again, even when life no longer makes them convenient. And perhaps that is the quiet truth about adulthood. Friendship is no longer sustained by proximity alone. It is sustained by intention. And the question we must ask ourselves is simple but profound. when life pulls us in different directions, who are we willing to keep walking toward? Another reason many college friendships begin to fade after graduation has less to do with distance and more to do with something subtler but far more powerful: the quiet shift in priorities and responsibilities that comes with adulthood. In college, friendship often sits at the center of daily life. Your schedule, your social world, even your emotional support system is built largely around the people you spend time with. Friends are not just companions, they are the ecosystem in which your life unfolds. You eat together, study together, celebrate together, and sometimes even struggle together. The rhythm of college life naturally places friendships at the forefront, but graduation introduces a different rhythm. Suddenly, life becomes structured around commitments that demand a different kind of attention. Work enters the picture, not as an occasional responsibility, but as a central organizing force. For many people, the first years after college are marked by the pressure to establish themselves professionally. There are long hours, steep learning curves, and the constant feeling that you must prove your worth. Energy that once went into friendships is now directed toward building stability. And work is only the beginning. As adulthood unfolds, other responsibilities begin to accumulate. Financial independence becomes a priority. Bills must be paid. Careers must be nurtured. Some people begin long-term romantic relationships, marriages, or even start families. Each of these transitions reshapes how time and emotional energy are distributed. What was once spontaneous becomes scheduled. Think about how friendships functioned in college. If you wanted to see a friend, you simply knocked on their door or sent a quick message. "Are you free?" There was a sense of immediacy, a sense that time belonged to everyone, even the most ordinary moments. Walking across campus, grabbing coffee between classes, became opportunities for connection. But in adulthood, time becomes fragmented. Now there are calendars, meetings, deadlines, commutes, personal obligations that didn't exist before. And friendship must find a place within a schedule that often feels already full. This is where something psychologically important begins to happen. Many people still value their college friendships deeply, but they begin to assume that those friendships are strong enough to survive without constant attention. There is a quiet confidence that the bond will always be there, and sometimes that assumption is correct. But relationships, like any living system, require nourishment. Not necessarily constant interaction, but moments of renewal, moments where people step out of the noise of their lives and re-enter the space of the friendship. Without those moments, even strong connections can slowly lose their vitality. Another factor that emerges after graduation is the shifting definition of emotional support. In college, friends are often the primary place where people process their fears, ambitions, and uncertainties. Late-night conversations serve as therapy sessions. Friends witness each other's evolving identities. In adulthood, however, emotional ecosystems become more complex. Romantic partners, co-workers, mentors, and family members begin to occupy spaces that friends once held exclusively. This redistribution of emotional energy doesn't mean the friendship has lost value, but it does mean that the role the friendship once played is changing. And change, even when it is healthy, can create distance. There is also an interesting paradox that appears in early adulthood. People often feel busier than ever, yet also lonelier than they expected to feel. They are surrounded by colleagues, responsibilities, and new experiences, but they sometimes miss the simplicity of friendships that once required so little effort. The irony is that the very people they miss are often experiencing the same thing. Two friends might both feel nostalgic for the closeness they once had, yet neither reaches out because each assumes the other is too busy. Silence grows not from lack of care, but from mutual hesitation. This is where intentionality becomes essential. Friendships that survive adulthood are rarely maintained by accident. They are sustained by small, deliberate gestures. A message that says, "I was thinking about you." A phone call during a long drive. A decision to visit, even when schedules make it inconvenient. These gestures may seem small, but they communicate something powerful. You still matter in the architecture of my life. And perhaps this is one of the most important lessons adulthood teaches us about relationships. In youth, connection is abundant and effortless. In adulthood, connection becomes a choice. Every person we keep in our lives occupies a space we have actively decided to protect. So when friendships begin to fade after college, it is not always because people no longer care about each other. Often, it is because life has quietly rearranged the hierarchy of attention. But the friendships that endure are the ones where, despite the noise of responsibility, someone pauses long enough to remember the people who once walked beside them, and then they reach out. Because in the end, the strongest friendships are not the ones that survived simply because life made them easy. They are the ones that survived because, even in a busy life, someone decided they were still worth the time. There is another element that quietly sustains many college friendships, and we often only notice it once it disappears. It is the shared environment, the physical and social world that surrounds people while they are students. In college, friendship does not exist in isolation. It is supported by a setting that constantly brings people together. The campus itself acts as a kind of social architecture. Classrooms, libraries, dormitories, cafes, student centers, and long walks between buildings all create repeated opportunities for interaction. These spaces make connection feel natural and almost inevitable. Think about how many college friendships begin. Often, it is not through deliberate effort, but through simple proximity. You sit next to someone in class. You live down the hall from them. You end up in the same study group. Over time, casual interactions turn into familiarity, and familiarity slowly deepens into friendship. What is remarkable is how much of this process happens without conscious intention. The environment does the work. It creates the conditions for connection. You see each other regularly. Conversations continue where they left off the day before. Shared routines form almost automatically, and before you realize it, that person has become an integral part of your life. But when graduation arrives, that environment dissolves. The campus, which once functioned as the backdrop of the relationship, disappears from daily life. Suddenly there are no more shared lectures, no more group projects, no more spontaneous encounters on the way to class. The invisible framework that supported the friendship is gone. What remains is the relationship itself, but now it must stand on its own. This transition can be surprisingly difficult because the absence of a shared environment changes the nature of interaction. When people no longer occupy the same spaces, every conversation requires a new level of effort. You must reach out deliberately. You must create the moment instead of stumbling into it. And many friendships struggle during this shift, not because the bond was weak, but because it was built within a context that no longer exists. There is also a psychological dimension to shared environments that we rarely acknowledge. Places carry meaning. They hold memories, emotions, and shared experiences. A particular cafe on campus might remind you of hours spent talking about life, love, and the future. A library corner might remind you of nights when everyone studied together, exhausted but determined. These places act as emotional anchors for friendships. When people leave that environment, they also leave behind the physical reminders of the connection. Without those cues, memories become more abstract. The friendship must now be sustained through communication alone, rather than through the constant reinforcement of shared experiences. In addition, the environments people enter after college are rarely designed for the same level of social openness. Workplaces, for example, operate under different dynamics. Professional boundaries exist. Competition may exist. Time is structured around productivity rather than exploration. In college, relationships often form around curiosity, about ideas, about identity, about the world. In many professional environments, conversations are more focused, more transactional. This doesn't mean friendships cannot develop in adulthood. Of course they can, but they often take longer to form, and they require a different kind of emotional investment. Meanwhile, the friends from college now exist in separate environments, each shaped by new communities, new routines, and new influences. Over time, these environments begin to shape people in different ways. One friend may become immersed in a fast-paced corporate culture. Another may enter an academic world that values reflection and theory. Someone else may be surrounded by family life or entrepreneurial risk-taking. Each environment subtly molds habits, perspectives, and daily experiences. And when friends reconnect, they sometimes discover that the shared context that once made conversation effortless has become less obvious. The jokes that once felt universal now require explanation. The daily struggles that once mirrored each other now look very different. But this moment of realization can lead us to an important insight about relationships. Shared environments make friendships easy, but they can also create an illusion that the friendship exists independently of effort. When that environment disappears, we are faced with a deeper question: what remains when convenience is removed? If two people continue to seek each other out, despite different cities, different careers, and different routines, then the friendship begins to transform. It moves from being a product of circumstance to being a product of choice. This is a more mature form of connection. It is less frequent perhaps, but often more intentional. The conversations may happen less often, but when they do, they carry greater meaning. In a way, leaving the shared environment of college forces friendships to reveal their true foundation. Were we friends because life placed us side by side? Or are we friends because even when life pulls us apart, we still choose to return to each other? And perhaps that is the quiet invitation hidden in this transition. To recognize that meaningful relationships do not depend solely on the places where they began. They endure when we decide that the connection matters more than the convenience that once sustained it. There is one final dimension that explains why some college friendships fade after graduation, and it may be the most complex of all. It has to do with something deeply human: the way we grow, evolve, and redefine who we are. College is often a period of identity formation. It is a time when people experiment with ideas, values, ambitions, and ways of seeing the world. Many of the friendships formed during those years are built within that shared process of exploration. Everyone is asking similar questions, even if they don't always say them out loud. Who am I becoming? What do I believe in? What kind of life do I want to build? In that environment, friendships become mirrors. We reflect parts of ourselves to each other. We validate each other's dreams, challenge each other's assumptions, and sometimes even help each other imagine futures we hadn't considered before. But the interesting thing about identity is that it doesn't stop evolving once college ends. In many ways, the years after graduation are when personal growth becomes even more intense. Now people begin to test their beliefs against the real world. Careers expose them to new cultures, new pressures, and new ways of thinking. Relationships deepen, responsibilities increase. The ideals that once felt abstract suddenly meet the realities of daily life. And during this process, people begin to change. Sometimes the changes are subtle. Interests shift. Priorities evolve. The things that once felt exciting may no longer carry the same meaning. Other times the changes are more dramatic. A person may discover a new passion, move across the world, adopt a completely different lifestyle, or rethink values that once felt certain. Growth is not linear, and it rarely happens at the same pace for everyone. One friend might pursue stability and structure, finding satisfaction in building a predictable life. Another might embrace uncertainty, chasing experiences and exploration. One person may grow deeply invested in family life. Another may focus intensely on professional ambition or creative pursuits. None of these paths are inherently better than the others. They simply reflect different ways of answering life's questions. But when friends evolve in very different directions, something subtle begins to happen within the relationship. The shared understanding that once felt effortless may begin to require translation. You may still care deeply about each other, but your daily realities are no longer the same. The conversations that once flowed naturally now require more curiosity, more listening, sometimes even more patience. In some cases, people embrace this evolution and allow the friendship to grow alongside it. They remain interested in who the other person is becoming. They make space for differences. They recognize that the value of the friendship lies not in similarity, but in connection. But in other cases, the changes feel more difficult to integrate. Sometimes people hold on to an earlier version of their friend, the version that existed during college. When the person in front of them begins to evolve, it can feel disorienting. They may wonder quietly, "You're not the same person I knew." And of course, that observation is true, but it is also true for both people. We often forget that the person we were during college was only one chapter of our identity. Growth means leaving parts of ourselves behind while discovering new dimensions of who we can become. The challenge is that friendships formed during identity formation are sometimes anchored in a specific version of ourselves. When that version changes, the relationship must adapt or risk slowly drifting apart. There is also a philosophical dimension to this process. Human beings are not static. We are constantly becoming. Our experiences shape us, our choices reshape us, and the environments we inhabit influence who we turn into over time. The friendships that survive long periods of growth are usually the ones that allow for that transformation. They do not demand that someone remain exactly who they were when the relationship began. Instead, they create space for evolution. This kind of friendship requires a particular mindset. It requires curiosity about the other person's journey, even when that journey looks very different from our own. It requires the humility to accept that change is not betrayal. It is simply the natural unfolding of a life. And when friends can approach each other with that openness, something remarkable happens. The relationship becomes less about shared circumstances and more about shared humanity. You are no longer friends only because you studied together, lived in the same dorm, or walked the same campus paths. You are friends because you continue to recognize something meaningful in each other's lives, even as those lives transform. But if that curiosity disappears, if people stop making the effort to understand who the other person is becoming, then the friendship may gradually lose its relevance. Not through conflict, but through quiet misalignment. And this brings us to one of the deeper truths about relationships in adulthood. The people who stay in our lives are rarely the ones who simply knew who we were. They are the ones who remain interested in who we are becoming. Because in the end, the strongest friendships are not frozen in time. They evolve just as we do. As